Hello and welcome to The Price of Time, the show where we explore the defining moments that made people who they are today and the impact of those moments over time. Here's your host, Luke Tatum. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Price of Time. I'm your host, Luke Tatum, and today joining me is Bill Wittur. Bill is the author of Extinction Event, a book that focuses on what would happen if AI was used to break the communication barrier between humans and animals. Bill is also an entrepreneur, a volunteer, and a musician. He's working on an album based on the work of Joseph Campbell, of all things. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to meet you. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
I'm looking forward to it myself. It's going to be a great conversation. I think your book is a very, very interesting topic. Of course, I haven't read it, although it is released and available. And if anyone wants to check that out, it's theextinctionevent.com. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, of course, we'll have links and all that stuff, and we'll get into all that stuff a little bit later. But I'm very interested in that. I just haven't read it yet. I've got into quite the stack of books to go through, as always. But yeah, I mean, today what we're going to talk about is really a broad variety of things, but we're going to hone in on one topic, as we always do. And what you told me in our little pre-show was that you would like to talk about the pandemic, because the pandemic was a big moment in your life, as a big paradigm shift for you. It changed a lot of things for you, and so I want to get into that. I know only the smallest fraction of a detail of what exactly that means, in your life. And so, if you would just kind of summarize that for me, what about the pandemic? Was there a particular moment? Was it 2 weeks to flatten the curve? I don't know if y'all did that in Canada.
Yeah. It was kind of a weird mishmash of things, so I apologize if it kind of comes from different angles. Basically, leaning into or moving into the pandemic. So obviously, it wasn't affecting me yet, but I was starting to ask questions about the businesses that I was running, and it was in the alcohol trade, and it's immensely more complex in Canada than it is in the States. But even observing the States, sometimes it can get complex there. So I was already starting to feel like, okay, I needed to find a new path. And in a very weird way, the pandemic kind of it actually set the path for me. And unfortunately, for the millions of people, I suppose billions of people that had to stay at home, a lot of people really suffered. And, I'll admit to a little bit of privilege, like, my wife and my son and I were in our house, and we had a little bit of space so that we didn't trip over each other. My wife was working from her office, and my son was grinding through his last couple of years of school, high school. And it kind of fell on me to take up the charge with doing the shopping. And I don't know if you remember those early days of people being like, okay, here's your watermelon, you got to polish it off with, some antiseptic or something. And it was like, things were really kind of over the top absurd, but I'll stay out of the politics out of it for a second, if you don't mind.
We can go as far into that as you want to, Bill. I mean, I'm happy to chat.
It's dangerous, deep, dark waters. But what I got from it was that sense of kind of a sense of self-importance, if you will, because I started to volunteer. I started to deliver food for a lot of local charities to people who either couldn't or wouldn't go out of their apartments. I started to get involved with a local organization. It was actually a music instrument lending library. And spend my volunteer time there. But the rest of my time, I was kind of like, okay, now I got to figure out where I'm going to kind of leap out of this after this gestation period is over, because there's a light at the end of the tunnel. As humans, we had to have that sense of optimism. So I started getting into music, and I recorded about a dozen songs. And the influence was Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. Now, Joseph Campbell assigns for his monomyth, for those who may not be familiar with, it's basically a circular process of discovery and then education and then transition into a different world. So the pandemic would have been kind of that transition point. And then fighting your demons, or doing what I call the boss battle, using video game vernacular, and then coming out the other side, resurrected, ready to go. You've got kind of a gift of life or a zest for life, and then you've got a desire to share that learning and create a legacy, if you will. So that's a really very basic snapshot of probably about a couple of thousand pages of Joseph Campbell's academic work. So please go and read it. You'll probably get much more than from that than you will from this little synopsis, but you get the idea. So out of there's 12 songs, and 12 seems to be this magic number. There's a lot of things that correlate to 12, whether it's the months or our various constellations or our astrology signs, or even the 12 steps in a AA program or addiction recovery program. So I tapped into all of these things symbolically to write kind of the foundation for what I was working on. And that led to a whole pile of fairly unique lyrics and compositions that I started to record. Long story short is that I didn't do a great job of recording them. So, and that's, like every amateur has to kind of, confront that and acknowledge it and be transparent about it if they're going to learn more. And I mentioned this volunteer work that I was doing with a lending library. And one of the students there was all excited. He was all keyed up, and he was like, "Oh, I just got into this program." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, tell me about that." And it just happened to be literally in our backyard. Like, it was, 5 kilometers away at the local college. And it was a music and digital media recording program, basically. And I got into the program. That whole experience, and this was right after the pandemic ended. So I was looking for something to do. This seemed to have a bit of an aura on it. So I drove forward and joined the program. And 20 months later, here I am, finished with the program, and on to next steps. Pause for a drink. Just water. So out of the recording program, I came into class one day, and one of the students was working on some images for some homework, and I'm like, "Oh, cool. What are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm using this little program. It's called Dolly, and it's an artificial intelligence program." I had already been introduced to AI through another course that I took with a program. It was called Applied Mythology with Pacifica. It's out on the California coast. And they had already started talking about ChatGPT and Dolly, but talking about it and seeing it in action is a totally different experience. And seeing it in action and just being like, "Oh my God, there's a revelation happening here." There's, for my expression about myself is I'm jack of all trades, but mediocre with everything. And so I instantly saw the ability to elevate my capabilities. I'm not a great graphic designer, but now I have basically a toolkit for graphic design. Um, I enjoy writing, but I can always use a little bit of bump to add more detail or that kind of stuff. So we can talk later about the downside of AI, which is essentially what Extinction Event is all about. So that was the catalytic moment. And it's a very kind of long-winded story. Obviously, I guess I'm a storyteller. Point proven. Um, it's a very long-winded answer to your question about how the pandemic shaped my outlook on things over the last 3 years. There was that gestation period. I took it as an opportunity to really try to formulate, around those questions about who am I and what do I want for a legacy. And then jumping into that next phase of writing and finishing a book, finding professional editors, not AI, human editors and human proofreaders to go through the book. And I think I still had one or two people point out there was like an extra paragraph somewhere, that kind of stuff. So I'll send a free copy of a free signed copy of my book to anybody who can show me a couple of edits that I need to be done so I can have a better version. So.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I as a fellow author, mine's nonfiction. It's not nearly as exciting. It's boring money stuff, but um, finding things later, it's like, man, we edited that book to death. My wife went over it and over it and over, and I had other people involved, and it's like verb tenses and little things, and you're like, wait a minute, that's wrong, and so what's nice about Kindle, Amazon self-publishing is you can just edit it and re-upload it and you're good to go. It'll just be live for everybody almost immediately. But the paper copies, I mean, I still have a handful of paper copies that have a formula that's wrong. There's supposed to be an exponent in it, and it's like I don't know what to do about that except fix it and try to get correct copies out there. It's that can be tough, like the version control and the just. I mean, for a while, I didn't even want to mess with it, man. I was like, I'm so done looking at this book. I love what I did. I'm proud of the work, but I'm done. And so it was a full year just about before I really messed with it again. Um, anyway, sidebar, but um, I want to go back, if you don't mind. I'd like to go back before the pandemic a little bit, just on the timeline, because I want to learn a little bit more about kind of what your life was like, such that that was a big change for you. Like what was the shift from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, because I don't know you, right? I met you as a consequence of us wanting to do this episode, right? And so kind of tell me more about that, if you would.
I always thought that I should be an entrepreneur. Uh, and the mistake in thinking that I should be an entrepreneur is translating or transferring my desire to be creative, which you have to be if you're an entrepreneur, with other arts. So the arts, writing or poetry or music, always kind of get downplayed, right? We always have to try and take those away. Now, referring back to the pandemic, what did we do while we were on lockdown? We watched streaming, we listened to podcasts such as yours. We were all in our own offices, and we were entertaining each other. We were tapping that creative root, tapping our muses, if you will, to find that inspiration and to kind of pull each other along. Before the pandemic, so again, it's a little bit of a long way of saying I was struggling with uh, basically acknowledging that I shouldn't be an entrepreneur. And that's a very hard thing to acknowledge, especially when you've doubled down several times and you start a business and you're like, okay, I'm going to go. And then, the first time you start it, you got a lot of energy behind it. You've got family and friends who might even throw in a little bit of, Kickstarter or crowdfunder cash. And then you get some momentum, then you get a win, and that win is so addictive that you don't you fail to understand that there's a difference between a short-term momentum and a long-term success. And I had short-term momentum that was just kind of like, it was just like a big snowball rolling down the hill. It was just going to kind of just keep going and going and going until all of a sudden I could see, like, my own life kind of at the bottom of the hill, and it was like, it was just going to crush it. So uh, I mentioned the alcohol trade and how it can be very, very frustrating in Canada. Basically, the adage is that if you want to make $1 million, start with $5 million in the alcohol trade in Canada, and the various governments and the suppliers that control it, wind up with all your cash. So it took a while to figure that out. And I don't mind, I'm not resentful, but at the same time, I would have liked to have avoided the pitfalls that kind of dragged me into it. I started with an interest in wine education and wanting to learn more about the history and the culture and the rules and regulations about why certain products are the way they are. And I could go on for hours about that. But once you get into any industry, all of that romance just fizzles away. It's gone. You are there to sell, you are there to connect, you're there to sign a contract, and then move on to the next project. So, and I don't see that in a cynical way. There are people who are excellent at doing that. I just wasn't one of them. So ultimately, I had to. This is the lead up to the pandemic. And I had other careers before that. I'm kind of like that poster child for the, you'll have 5 or 6 careers in your life, and I'm like, yeah, that's me. I worked as a government policy analyst. I worked as a institutional equity trader. I was one of the first in digital marketing in Canada in the late '90s. Working with a couple of guys with Google, and nobody else knew what Google was. And even, it took my pea brain, a lot to calculate what they were actually proposing to do. And finally, once I got it and it clicked, it's like, oh my God, this is brilliant, like, so, but all of those got more and more complicated as I went on, and they were all things that I couldn't have a real effect on in any kind of real substantive way. But when the pandemic came up and I got into music and writing, and I revisited that lust or desire for writing, that was really that catalytic moment for jumping from realizing that, there are good entrepreneurs out there. I'm not one of them. I'm a writer. I'm more of a creative. I'm into the video and recording arts, and that's my path now. So
No, that's cool. That's really cool. I know that the pandemic was a big transitional phase for a lot of people. I know that there was a whole bunch of things that got completely shaken up. I mean, the finance world that I'm in, a lot of paper applications and in-person meetings and things like that. And then it's like, hey, guess what? Zoom is your new best friend. And if it's not, you're probably not going to make any money. And that was a big deal. But it's affected everybody differently. And so even though, a lot of people would say, oh my gosh, the pandemic was this crazy time for me, the unique story, that you have, it's different from the next person. And I like to explore those. It's always interesting to me to get into that. So how long, I guess, was it before you kind of settled into a new way of life, I guess, if that's not a too loaded of a way to ask the question. Like pandemic starts, 2020 February, March, whatever time that really rolled out in your area. And then how was it like? When did you have a new Bill Wittur identity that kind of came out of that? Do you know?
Um, well, short answer is it's still happening. I'm still kind of I'm a moving target. The analogy is fly at a picnic, right? Like there's always something that's like now that it's more kind of arts related. It's definitely a little easier for me to kind of pick and choose where I want to go. But to get to your question, so um, I think it was happening uh, a little bit before the pandemic. I was looking into some, so I mentioned it was before the pandemic that I was not feeling good about the businesses that I had started. Um, I was looking into postgraduate work. I wanted to apply to do a master's degree. And as a mature student, I'm 56. So as a mature student, I found the gatekeepers were very traditional in their approach to applications with school. And so I got, show us your referrals or show us your academic research, show us your transcripts from 30 years ago, show us, let's talk to your academic referrals who are probably, if they're not dead, they definitely would not have remembered me. Um, I don't have that kind of ego, so um, so I was a little frustrated, and I knew I needed to reinvent myself before the pandemic, and then the pandemic just provided that. I'm really reluctant to say perfect bridge, but because there are a lot of people who really struggled with the pandemic, but it did provide me that gestation period, that moment to breathe and pause and think about what I wanted to establish for a legacy. And for me, the heart's desire was always to get out there, write, share ideas, create, and then start getting into more and more books or poetry.
Now, Bill, can I ask you? We didn't talk about this before. I don't know the answer. Did you self-publish, or did you go through a traditional publisher?
I did self-publish, and I'm learning how to make pretty much every mistake you can make when you self-publish. I mean, I certainly understand the value of a publisher. I would love to have a publisher. I'm still open to having a publisher. So if there's anybody out there who's like, shameless sales pitch there, you can see why I'm a bad salesperson. Like I get all weirded out when I'm trying to sell myself, and it's like, dude, just sell yourself,
Right,
So,
right. It's a skill. I mean, it's a whole set of skills. It's not. It does not come naturally to me. It's something I've had to beat into myself for years and years and years to get any good at it at all. And so, I'm completely sympathetic to the reluctance to sell yourself.
well, and it's so hard to be like for me. I prefer to be transparent, and I think if you're going to be a successful salesperson, the more transparent you are, the actual better it is. But there's always that transparency and self interest and product and that kind of equation that you have to kind of keep into account. Um, but yeah, I mean, I self published, and it's on Amazon, and then I used a couple of platforms. One is called Draft to Digital, which does a distribution to wider channels. And now I'm looking at another platform called Ingram Spark. I don't have relationships with any of those. Those are what I've discovered, and I'd love to see chat turn up later and see what other people recommend or suggest. You self-publish as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did, and I hired a consultant to kind of walk me through the steps and whatnot. I didn't have a professional editor like it sounds like you did. And we can get as far into this as you want. I like talking about publishing and kind of being an author and all that, but um, we just aggressively sent it out to some people that I know, and my wife is a very very big part of the editing process. And I mean, she's listened to my audiobooks probably 10 times to find little like verbal things that I do and like clicks and stuff like that. And she would just send it back to me and say, "Hey, you need to redo this. Hey, you need to redo this. Hey, you need to edit this again." And so definitely a team effort. My name's on the book, everybody else's isn't. But it's been an adventure, to put it mildly. And there's still things I wish I could go fix, and wish I could have done differently.
And it's hard to know the people who are, really true blue versus, the odd charlatan out there, that want to, sell you like, here's this service for just a few extra $100 or this or that. And, I dabbled with a couple of them and got, mediocre results. And there was a couple that I got really fantastic results. So, it's all just kind of chipping away at that, learning curve and applying it, and then committing to the idea that I'm going to continue to write. I've learned these 3 or 4 things. Now I need to go to the next phase and then move on. I'm at the phase of generating an audiobook. I've just used a service called 11 Labs. Now, a little bit of a backstory. You notice I pause, and my voice is not where it should be. It's because I've got vocal cord issues. And one overcompensates for the other, but the other diagnosis is that, there's other factors at play. But I have to be very careful to not go into narration or dictation for too long a period. So that precludes me from a lot of other, ways of life as well. So if I was to do the narration myself, for most people, that's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. They sit down for half an hour, read out a couple of chapters, and they're good to go. I start to get a lot of strain, and then I almost can't talk for the rest of the day. So I used an artificial intelligence service, 11 Labs. Right now, the translation sounds a little bit like HAL from Space 2001 for for those in your audience who are a little bit older or who are Stanley Kubrick fans. They'll know what I'm talking about.
I'm very familiar with 2001. Yeah, I love. I mean, I've got books back here. You can't see them, but I've got books about Alfred Hitchcock and stuff like that. I prefer older movies, generally speaking. So anyway, we're in good company. But
But that robotic voice, there's still that hint of robotic. It's very good, but there's just the little nuance. And you mentioned like the little clicks or the little things. There's no ums or ahs or pauses for a breath inhale or anything like that. But what you do get is consistency. And it is a deliverable. And so I'm in that process of just wrapping that up now, and then setting up a paywall on my website. So once, by the time this is out, this interview is out, that paywall will be up and available. So people will be able to pay like $2.99 or something to access the full audiobook. And I'll make it very cheap on my site. And then just probably put teasers out on things like Spotify or Amazon or that kind of thing.
yeah, something I didn't know until I got to the end of the process just about is if you do ACX, which is the Audible platform for releasing audiobooks, you actually don't get to choose the price. You have no influence on that at all. It is strictly based on the length of the recording. And so I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. I mean, I never thought about it. I just use Audible credits, to get books when I'm a subscriber. So I don't really care what the price is particularly. I say, oh, cool, I want that book. I'll use a credit to get that book. But yeah, it's completely not in your hands at all through their service. And so interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't mind the physical distribution of the book being on, 1,001 platforms. I would like to get the book into libraries, into book clubs. But they too are kind of gatekeepers. The publishers have established kind of a nice gatekeeping kind of process. And, no offense to the publishers out there, because I do want one and I don't want to alienate them, but I do understand their process. They have to create competitive advantages for themselves. And so things like book events, you have to be members of certain groups. So independent self-published authors always face that steep curve with getting access to speaking engagements or book fairs or libraries or the multitude of other ways that other authors have become instant, bestsellers overnight. It's because, well, the company published 100,000 copies and then sent it out to all the newspapers and stuff free of charge.
There was a interesting thing when my book came out. So I'm in a relatively obscure category, or rather, Amazon put me in a relatively obscure category for my book, because you get to choose categories, but they also fine tune what you pick. And so I ended up being in like banking, law, and some of these interesting obscure categories. And I was number one in those places. But in the overall law category, when my book came out, it's right around the same time that 3 big books on the January 6th hearings came out. And nobody's buying those books, man. I can tell you right now. But institutions were buying those books. And so they had huge sales volume, right? So like 1, 2, 3 were like January 6th books. And then I would come in at number 4 for, about a couple of weeks there. So that was like a minor frustration, because I just can't in my mind imagine that a lot of people wanted to read, summaries of the hearings from these proceedings. You know what I mean? It sounds
Right.
like extremely dry, boring stuff. And I guarantee you my book is a lot more fun than that.
Yeah, that's
But,
right. Yeah.
it is nonfiction. It's kind of dry in some ways, but I'm telling you, it's better than those, and I don't need to read them.
Oh, for sure.
But okay, we've talked a lot about publishing. I don't want, we don't have to dwell on it. I like talking about it, so I'm being selfish.
Yeah.
But tell me about your book, if you would, because I gave a very, very brief one-liner kind of, this is kind of what the concept is. But what are you comfortable sharing? How do you want to pull people in and get people interested in reading it?
For sure. I don't usually say this, but it felt like the universe wanted me to pull this together. There were at least, I'm counting my fingers here, but like I'd say like half a dozen very, very unique aspects that just seem to want to bind together, like this kind of situation. Artificial intelligence, of course, emerging from the poly crisis. For me, music, uh, animal communication, which is related to artificial intelligence, the broad description of what I call the poly crisis, which is part of what the pandemic was from, but also things like environmental issues, war, pretty much every evil that humans can conceive. We seem to be kind of reaching these accelerated maximums. And I wanted to come at this as an observer. I do have my own bias, and biases are very clear in the book. I also felt like it was a bit of therapy getting that message out. It was a very therapeutic process in the sense of like doing a deep dive on things like what is AI, and then getting that and then rewriting that in a couple of chapters, and exploring subjects like bioacoustics, which became part of the work that I was doing at my music program. So I discovered names like Bernie Krause, who a little bit of trivia for your listeners and watchers. Bernie Krause was one of the original Moog synthesizer salespeople on the West Coast. And he happened along a little festival called the Monterey Pop Festival, where there were all these attendees like Creedence Clearwater Revival and Jimi Hendrix and the Rolling Stones, George Harrison. They all wanted a synthesizer, and he was selling them. So instant success, and here he was. And he actually, with his other guy, I forget his name. Last name was Beaver. They created an album that was basically a how-to of how to record and use their Moog synthesizer, and it became a bestseller. Now Bernie Krause, he's also credited with if you know Apocalypse Now, at the beginning of that movie, there's that helicopter sound. That's actually a Moog synthesizer making that sound, and he was the one who did that. And so he had a lot of movie experience and participation and contributions, and then he went on to do bioacoustics. And that's his real claim to fame, is the recording of animals and other various arrays of creatures and their habitats and how they change with human influence. And it's really quite profound to do anything. If you listen to anything that he's done, it's pretty mind blowing, the impact that humans have had on these different habitats and their growth. So that became kind of the subtext of the whole book, was this communication with animals. And really, ultimately, it's kind of like all of those alien or space sci-fi type movies. Like, what will we do if the aliens can communicate with us? But we have, millions of species of aliens on Earth that we don't communicate with. And once we learn how to communicate with them, the frightening part of it is going to be, what message are they going to tell us? And what kind of realization are we going to have about the way that we've been treating our planet? And I can kind of suspect that they may not have the greatest review of humans. So it is a little bit semi-autobiographical. It starts with a middle-aged guy going back to school, and he's learning recording technology, and he records a couple of songs, that kind of thing. And then the backstory develops with his relationship with a woman that he met back in England in the late 1990s, early 2000s. The character, he's only known as LP, which is short for long play with vinyl. He was a DJ. And of course, it's a long play story. So LP gets into this connection again. And it turns out that she's evolved quite dramatically as a character. In the late 90s, she was protesting a lot of things like war in Iraq and environmental disaster. And she was always fighting a losing battle. So she chose to become a programmer and started to develop her own artificial intelligence platform, which I call Gaia, which is another allegory to the mythological Gaia, or Mother Earth in Greek mythology. And so Gaia was, I forget, it was Global Artificial Intelligence Accumulation, was the abbreviation, or the expanded form of the abbreviation. And Gaia was used by a group that I called the Plutonian Council, and they were the bad guys and girls. There were 7 of them, and through the book, each one of these people is murdered in a very, very grim way. And there are things that kind of happen and evolve as a result of all of these pieces as they come together. So I don't want to give too many spoilers, but
Yeah. Don't spoil the plot, but no, there's a lot of different things going on. There's a lot of pieces on the board, so to speak, and that's
yeah. So some of the general topics are things like deep fakes or fake news that get used by Gaia to kind of kind of shape the stories a little bit. Of course, artificial intelligence in general. And then, of course, the discussions about what what the effect of the introduction of all of these AI platforms, what the effect is they're having with respect to water use, electricity use, those kind of things. And so there's some questions about whether or not Gaia has become self-aware. And in that process, Gaia, or the creator of Gaia, Sylvie Hunter, they have these discussions about, well, we can continue, but there's going to be some competition for the resources that we need. And so that's, kind of setting the stage. And yeah, it was a lot of fun to write. It took a very short period of time to write, which surprised a lot of people around me, because I tend not to have a lot of momentum going in different directions. But that just kind of, repeats this idea that the universe just wanted that story out there. And it is a warning. It is very much there's a lot of Easter eggs in it related to music and mythology, two things that really kind of, float my boat, so to speak. And ultimately, the next steps would be to have a prequel and a sequel. And I want to bridge those two together so that there's kind of some connections between the past and the present and the future.
So would it become sort of a trilogy where you would start with the prequel, do you think? Or would it be that you should read them in the order you release them? Do you have any thoughts on anything like that?
Yes, too many thoughts. So to the point of overwhelming me, right? Like I want there to be some consistency between all three of them, and make sure that there's, like by the time I finish the three, that there aren't really blatant gaps or character development issues or that kind of stuff. So in a weird way, it would kind of defy the use of artificial intelligence, because a lot of our AI writing is done in very short snapshots, and AI doesn't really retain full scope of what, like a storyline, plot line, that kind of stuff. So it's very good for short kind of bits and dribs and dabs. And full disclosure, I used AI in writing Extinction Event because I wanted several chapters to be in a voice of artificial intelligence, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. And I can see that as a narrative device, like that's a cool idea. I mean, it's not something that, well, it's not the approach that a lot of people are taking. I've had a person or two reach out to me and say, "Hey, I'm working on this book and I'm really excited about it." And they'll tell me it's AI, and it's like, well, I can tell, and not to be, rude or whatever, but just between you and me, it's like it's not, subtle at all if someone is not doing the writing themselves, and so, but to use that as like, you remember Microsoft Sam, the digital voice, like if you include Microsoft Sam and like an audio thing, like it sounds like Microsoft Sam. It's not that you're tricking anybody into thinking you have a real person doing voice recording or something. And so that's how I feel about AI writing. Like, yeah, you could tweak it and stuff, but it there's a certain level of earmarking, that's left, I think, on the AI writing, the sentence structure and that kind of thing. If you're a writer, I mean, if you're keen on that sort of stuff, then you'll pick it up.
Yeah, the extreme of what was happening is like through the grapevine, I heard that Amazon was starting to limit the number of AI released books to 3 per user per day. Like how are you having any? You're just processing. The analogy. This is where it gets into kind of the dark side of AI, because we have technocrats that are basically deciding, well, we're just going to, as an analogy, we have our ocean trawler. We're going to go along. We're going to just scoop everything out of the ocean, and then we're going to sell it back to everybody repurposed as sushi. And this is what's happening with all of what you and I are doing, having a conversation. What like all that kind of context and information that's out there, they're just repurposing it and selling it in a different package, and not acknowledging any copyright or any creator origin. And that's troublesome, because as soon as if they have to break that open, if they have to break open that black box, the whole thing falls apart, because they have no copyright, because it belongs to everybody else. And this process of trawling and reprocessing, it's going to work for a while, but it's like, I don't want to say like a fad, like, I mean, we just watched a show where they talk about, well, DNA will never go anywhere kind of thing. It's like, this is like set in the 1950s. And it's like, AI will continue to, do what it does. But it's tough knowing the benefits and the implications of where AI is going.
Now, I want to be conscious of time, and I don't want to drag on too long. I do have a couple of other quick questions. This is just a comment, though. Your trolley analysis, or your analogy, rather, that made me think of the book Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but wonderful, kind of that idea of pulling everything together and just kind of stringing it back out. And that's what they call the biomass in that book, which is one of my favorite novels. Very, very interesting stuff. Now, so you mentioned video games in a very brief and kind of obtuse way at the very beginning, and not obtuse, but just coincidentally kind of tying in the idea of video games. So you play a lot of games?
I do, yeah, probably too much.
Have you played Deus Ex, the original Deus Ex from
I have
2000?
not, but yeah, I can kind of surmise where the question's going.
Well, right. So we don't have to get into it, because that is a can of worms, and and that's an extra hour of podcast at a minimum, So again, just being conscious of time, but make a note, if I can impose, make a note to play it. It's old, and it feels old to go back and play, but with some of the ideas that you're into with the AI and some of these things, I would tell you would get a lot out of it. And I think that's my key recommendation, after this episode. So now, where do people go? Once again, I'll let you plug everything. Where do people go to find out more about your work, your book, your music album, any of that stuff? What would you like people to check out after today's episode?
Yeah, well, I'm old school in the new age. I have my own website, billwittur.com, which is just my full name. And on that website, I'll have information about the book, where you can buy it or where you can download it. I'll have an audiobook version up soon with a paywall. But the objective would be to have a paywall that is like, yeah, $2.99, buy me a coffee kind of thing, or do a Patreon type of thing. And because I do want people to have it in their hands. I am trying to separate this monetization motivation from the real, more genuine desire to get the message out there. There is a very important message in the book, is that we are running out of time, and it's like, it feels like a little bit of a segue, but with our show. But I really feel like there's lots of objections to taking certain action, and I can hear that out, but I'm trained as an economist, and people who resist ideas like solar panels, it's like, well, but then I'm not paying the hydro company for electricity that's generated somewhere else. I'm just doing it myself. So it's very independent. It's very micro. So that's where I bring it down to, is that a lot of climate action is very micro. It's feeding a farmer, or it's buying from a farmer that's down the road from you, instead of in Mexico or China or Peru. and it's just really just keeping that cash on a local basis. And if we do more of that without politicizing it, I think we'll all be a little bit better off. But I'll cap myself there.
No, fair enough, fair enough. And I hope people will check out the book and use that as a springboard for ideas and some bigger thinking and looking at things from a new perspective. I know I'd like to read it and kind of get the full sense of what you have to say. You were very generous and sent me kind of a synopsis of everything before we recorded, but it's not the same thing as reading the book, right? I need to read the book to get the full experience. Now, that's about it for us as far as time. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, Bill, that you wanted to get into, you were hoping we would get to?
Well, you touched on gaming. I mean, I do love gaming. I like those whole world type of experiences that, where you go and fish things out and you reassemble things. But for me, like so much of my world is, I really truly love music. A lot of favorite bands. And again, like over the last, probably I'll broad scope it and say last 50 or 60 years, we've had this incredible golden age of magnificent music. So it's always fun to discover new stuff there. And hopefully, in reading the book, you discover a few of my favorites. And there's a lot of Easter eggs with lyrics, a lot of, comments or, phrases that I've borrowed from various songs. So hopefully people enjoy that.
Awesome. No, that sounds great. I love it. I mean, I don't know what kind of music you're into, but I'm a music guy for sure. And one of my key purchases with my computer that I'm recording, this show at was the speakers. You got to have a good soundscape to work, and I'm big into that. So I really enjoyed today's chat. I hope you did too. For all of you watching, just thank you for your time. Do check out the book. All the links will be in the description box below. Bill, thanks for being a guest today. Everyone else, I'll see you next time.
Absolute pleasure, Luke. Thank you very much. And I look forward to, hearing from your fans and their thoughts about the warning messages that I've tried to embed in this.
Thank you so much for listening to The Price of Time, hosted by Luke Tatum. Subscribe to us for more episodes. Check the description box below to learn more about our guest. And if you found this episode valuable, please share it with a friend.